Welcome to Evans Radio. We are back with Danny Lamartina and the Bro in the Brain for back part two because the back is so huge in terms of musculature and honestly like form and function that you can't, I don't think you could do service in 1 hour.
No, definitely not. Definitely not. I think even putting into two episodes is like there's a lot of hairs we could split, right? So keeping
Right.
it as simple as possible.
Right. So where I thought I would start is the upper back. And I know you're a big fan. And honestly, if you look at someone's physique as a whole, the rear delts are technically part of the back, right? Which is always interesting for me because I've always trained shoulders either by themselves or after chest. I've not that I remember at least have ever had a day consistently where I trained rear delts with my back. And maybe that's one of the reasons why they're so blown out is because I would do back on Mondays and then do chest and shoulder on Tuesday. So I get back to back rear delt days.
Right?
Weird theory. Yeah. I know years ago I watched a video of Michael Lockett where he was talking about doing like double split days where you would do chest in the morning and then chest again at night.
Mhm.
But let me ask you this. Do you view the rear delt as part of the back? Or I know when you're with me, we train rear delts with your shoulders. So,
I think I'm kind of like you in that there's a million ways we can swing it, right? It kind of depends on how do we need to prioritize everything else around the week. And rear delts to me are one of those things that because they're not super taxing, you can put them in on a couple different days. It's kind of like once you get the big rocks in place, to me, they're the smaller things kind of fill in the gaps with. But um, personally, I like doing a little bit of rear delt work on both an upper day and a pull day.
okay.
So,
Perfect.
but for you, I mean, when you're structuring that out for people, especially if we're thinking like back training,
Mhm.
how and when do you decide when you're going to put rear delt training in versus when you're just going to leave it as a strictly like back day?
This is really funny because I honestly never put a ton of thought into it, which sounds
Yeah.
weird. Right? But when I assess someone's physique, I always feel like it's very similar to how I view like, yes, we're going to work some triceps when you press heavy dumbbells for chest or barbells or Smith machines, but I don't count that volume for my triceps in a chest day. So when I think about when I'm building a plan for someone and I'm building a back workout, I think more about, okay, we want to attack where they're lagging first when they're fresh, and then I want to progress away from that area, right? So let's say you have lagging lats. I'm going to start with lats, then I'm going to get into upper back, and then I'm going to finish with erectors. Logically, that makes sense to me. I would never want to put erectors first because that's super high taxing. And then the question of stability comes into play in my mind if your erectors are trashed going through the rest of your session. So I kind of work around it. Now, if your upper back is
Mhm.
weak, I would actually kind of pepper upper back, lats, back to upper back, lats, back to upper back, then erectors. Now, why is that? I just kind of found it feels good. No real reason or science behind that. And then if we're speaking rear delt specific, I'm thinking about my rear delt's going to get work. Anything I do semi-pronated to fully pronated, and honestly, any type of rowing, my rear delt's going to take work if I'm being honest. Um, because anytime I've ever trained back, my rear delts get pumped. Like
Mhm.
if I hit a back lat spread, my it looks like I trained rear delts even though I didn't directly hit them with something that's going to be like a pec deck, meaning a reverse pec deck or like a bent over or lateral. They're going to look like I fully trained them.
Hmm. I feel like you're very, very lucky in that way. Because most people that I talk to, and granted, I talk to people who hurt, right? So maybe like there's something to be said for that, but they have a really hard time actually feeling and connecting with rear delts. And it's one of those areas that consistently, I think you and I would train them the same in terms of reps, volume, things like that. We both probably really are on the same side of the fence with that. But it's one of those muscle groups people in general have a really, really hard time connecting with. And I can speak on that mechanically in terms of like, what's happening with the shoulder blade and spine shape and how spine shape is going to determine shoulder position and subsequently like rear delt position. But I'm kind of wondering, for people like you who are put together to be very sturdy, like you're pretty sturdy, you're pretty durable.
Right. Yep.
Um, do you feel like you get a rear delt pump when you're doing back work, or is it just the kind of thing where afterwards, like you're so pumped globally that you're like, yeah, they got what they needed?
Yes. The second one. I also think that I spent years, literally years. I'm not being funny. That's not an exaggeration.
Mhm.
I spent years learning how to feel my rear delts because I couldn't, right? I always allowed on my delt training for my traps to steal everything, meaning upper trap or even mid trap.
Mhm.
And when I look at the people that either come into town or the people in the gym, I know this may sound simple and maybe it's not for everyone, but the location of their delt to ear is why most people, when they go to do anything rear delt based for me, right? It's always here first. Like you got to keep, for me, I have to keep that down and depressed. And then it's just thinking about taking my arm away from my body. And then
Mhm.
also knowing when, and for me, my active range of motion for rear delt, where other body parts don't work, which I think if you looked at my entire rear delt training as a whole, most of the really smart people would tell me my range of motion is too short. But for me, that's where it stays on my rear delt and doesn't get into any other body part, meaning
Mhm.
tearing, fucking trap, mid trap, none of that. So that, and maybe I can't teach that over the internet, but in person, it's really easy to do.
No, I think you can. Like I think this is one of those things that people can see if they're willing to stop for a moment and pause. And you've, over a couple of episodes now kind of walked in and said, look, if you see the muscle moving, it's probably the prime mover.
Correct.
I think if people are willing to actually pause and look at, okay, well, past a certain point in motion, I'm not abducting my arm, my shoulder blades are moving back. Do I think that's a bad thing necessarily? Because people also ask me all the time, like, do I need to keep my shoulder blades totally still? Should I stop the range? And I'm like, you don't have to.
Right.
It's a question of if that allows you to get into that fully shortened position and being in that fully shortened position drives improved, proprioception. And we talked about the role of proprioception and being able to have feed forward effects to get better stuff, later. Okay, sure. Maybe you allow, full range of motion, even if it gets a little messy at the end.
Right.
Um, but I think that, it was interesting. My antenna kind of went off a little bit because generally when people feel like they end up doing this and like their ears are in their, I'm sorry, shoulders are in their ears, generally the shape of the rib cage when that happens is one that's very flat in the back. And I would
Okay.
treat that more as like a restriction in certain particular ranges of motion and testing, and that would then change, movement selection. So I think a lot of times, like especially if you look at someone doing a reverse pec deck, and those people who have like, a really, really flat spine, and we talk about like winging scapula. Um, that's a whole conversation we can have on another day. Like we could talk about, like shoulder injuries and scap mechanics and whatnot.
Right.
But the idea of the winging scapula, it's not as much like, we got to get subscap and serratus working to pull it back onto the rib cage. A lot of times the shape of the rib cage is kind of determining like what if the scap should do this
Mhm.
and it ends up doing this. It's because the surface it sits on is not great. So how can we then, as an athlete, position ourselves in a way that allows best motion? So when Dave and I do reverse pec deck, we use the same machine, we use the prime machine at destination, and we have to use it totally differently.
Okay.
So he can really think about he sits down, he keeps his shoulders literally at, sternum level, and he
Right.
can get really, really wide.
Okay.
I have to almost to prop myself up and almost angle slightly down
Okay.
and work with that angle because my scapula is in a forwardly tipped position.
Mhm.
So I need to put it in a position where we can find a little bit of posterior tip so the shoulder can move.
Right.
So um anyway, kind of where I was going with that is I think that if someone has a hard time feeling rear delts and training them really well in the context of back training, especially if they're hitting them at the end of the session where you've probably already put the rib cage in a different position with other movements you've hit. It might just mean that you have to make a few concessions with your own position, what you think needs to happen, and kind of reevaluate. So,
I can, if that was a goal of mine to really hammer my rear delts and to fill them on a back day, I would probably start. I would definitely have my guys start with band pull aparts for 4 sets of 20 on a back day. Now, I will tell you this, something else really cool that I've done in the past for my guys who don't have rear delts but want them is start their chest day with 4 sets of 20 to 30 of something that they feel the best for rear delt.
I have a lot of my guys too.
I will also share this piece of advice. Early on, John said to me in person, Chris, I've always just been blown away and impressed by guys with big hamstrings and giant rear delts. And listen, that went right here.
Yeah.
And I didn't have to say, oh, I'm going to show you. I just thought, I put this in my brain. I'm like, okay, I'm going to get that one day. So he's impressed. And he thinks, man, he really listens to me. And, you know, I'll share a rewarding story with you guys. There was one day we were training at American Barbell, and Noah was like, "Hey, Chris, strip that shirt off. Let's see what your pump looks like." And I was like, "No, man, fucking John's here." Like, no. And he's like, "Just do it. It'll look good on camera." I'm like, "All right." He's like, "The light's good." So I did that, and like my delts were so pumped that day that he was like, "Good God!" He's like, "I want that as the thumbnail." And I'm like, "Yes."
You know you made it when.
Right, right, right. Yeah.
That's going to Chris's memory bank of top moments all time.
Correct. And literally, yeah. I went home and I made that my mission when he first said it to me. Like, okay, you got to figure out how to train your delts, and then you got to get good at it, and then you just got to do it on repeat. And I think that that's probably now why I didn't have a pro don't have a problem with feeling it. I will tell you this also. Early on in my back training, it was really popular when I started bodybuilding to everything wanted to be done wide grip, like wide grip pull downs, wide grip pull ups.
Yeah.
And still to this day, and even then, like I couldn't feel my lats work one bit. My rear delts would get on fire just by doing wide grip lat pull downs or pull ups. And again, I don't know if that means maybe that my body is set up and structurally designed to have big shoulders, but they used to be my worst body part when I started with John. So if that gives you any insight. So if you're out there, don't get discouraged, I guess is the right words.
Yeah, well, and be willing to change movements for you, right? Like my rear delts really started to take off. It's not that they're small, it's that when I sit with my shoulders just where they are at rest, they look small. But when I pose and put my arm in a position where they actually have the opportunity based on muscle position to pop out. And I remember too that like how big your rear delts look is going to depend on your positions and your posing. It's just like if you're going to, I mean, it's no different than any other muscle. If you want your lats to look big, you pose properly for, the muscle to display itself. And I think rear delts are one of those muscles that are especially prone to needing that.
Yeah.
So one thing that Kenny had me change last year was changing my hand position just based on shoulder rotation because that allows the rear delt to kind of pop off the bone a little bit more. So I think sometimes too, it's that we assume they're small, but maybe it's just they're not in a position to be displayed.
And then I think
So
we would be remiss if we didn't admit that, or at least how the muscle inserts and where it's shaped also impacts that. I realize that the way my delts are shaped are very fortunate. Let's just put it that way. Like they have good shape to them. So I think that plays a role in it. So if I'm thinking about rear delts, for me, how I would work that is like if I'm going to do it on a back day, I'd want something at minimum semi-pronated grip, whether that be an incline dumbbell row, whether that be a machine row, like that's an overhand grip. Um, and then I would do some kind of rear delt movement, 3 to 20 reps, and that can be whatever you feel the most. Like you said, you like to get your hands down by your side. There's nothing wrong with setting the cables up here, and as opposed to pulling them here, like I'd like to just pull them there, and squeeze that rear delt.
well, that's where some of that structural stuff that we are talking about with the wides versus narrows and all that, like a lot of the guys that I work with, if they need rear delts, we got to look at how their body is set up to move well. So a wide is going to do really well out here, a narrow, and this is something I've really come to appreciate. My rear delts took off when I started doing this rear delt tricep that I absolutely hated, but it really kind of hung out at this lower angle. I just had to make sure I wasn't getting tricep involved with that. And even teres can be real sneaky there, right? Um, so I think with regards to back day too, how we train rear delts can also kind of offset some of the compression. So one of the reasons I do like having it at
Mhm.
the end of a back day
Right,
is all the squeezing of the muscles that basically attach to the rib cage for a lot of us end up kind of like taking our whole smushing it.
right.
And I think a lot of rear delt training can actually work to open up the front of the shoulders. And for most of us, it's where we're pretty restricted anyway. So from a training standpoint, it can be beneficial, but I think there's a lot of just kind of secondary benefit to doing it towards the end of the session too.
Agreed. No, I agree. All right, so you already mentioned that where I wanted to go next is Terry's, and that's one of the things I sent you a video I think last week where I was posing and you're like, do you do anything specifically for your teres? And I was like, yes, but I need to do more of it. So if someone came to you with that problem of needing the teres more developed, which I actually think is interesting because most people who have really well-developed teres, most uneducated assume that that's lat, right? Like they're like, oh, look how their lats look really good in like a back double, right? Where I'm like, oh, that's a lot of fucking teres, man. Like, what would be some go-to exercises that you'd recommend for someone who has that problem of not having teres?
I'm going to back up and say most people don't have that problem. But the reason that I brought it up for you was more related to shape and position and kind of like, okay, like we know that for you, changing rib cage shape is a long-term thing, right? So short term, what can we do to change the shape? Okay, well, we could look at creating more width up top to create the illusion of, a greater taper.
Right.
That was kind of why I went there. Does that make
Yes.
sense?
Yes, it does. Yeah, because you need that
Uh,
muscle coming out of like your armpit, so to speak. Uh, if people don't know anatomy, that's just a great way to think about it.
I think a lot of people actually have a lot of teres, and that's part of the problem is they think teres is lat. Like a lot of
Oh,
people think this is lat, like right
right.
up here. And it's like, okay, well, close. But
Yeah,
like
right. Yeah.
when I first started lifting, I was told like, oh yeah, wide grip pull downs, totally lats, right?
Right.
And then we swung the other way. It's like, oh no, it's upper back. And it's like, okay, well, people think upper back and they think between the shoulder blades. I'm like, okay, you're getting some of that if you're getting full concentric, but who do you know that is able to actually fully pull the bar down to their chest without compromising shoulder mobility on a wide grip pull down? Like one person, maybe
Right.
at best, right? So if we're gonna do, if we're really talk about this from the standpoint of upper back, that would involve like we'd have to really drive those gaps together. Most people aren't going to have that. So I think that's something to consider too, just kind of the landscape of what people consider upper back, things like that. Personally, I think keeping it really simple, a couple sets of wide grip pull downs.
Right. Yep.
I mean, I'm sure there are better and fancier ways. You probably have them, but I just tend to see people have they have plenty there.
Right.
They're convinced that's their lat. But what about you? What do you see?
I agree with you that most people tend to have more teres than actual lat. Yes. Another exercise that I feel personally a lot there that if you don't really understand the anatomy of the body, but you're good at listening to your own, the rack chin is huge for that.
That's a great one.
Yeah. And that's because like I will tell you this, like if you're doing them right, it feels like your armpits are on fire.
Yeah, literally feels like they're going to tear off.
Right. And that's how I describe it to people when I want to get them to do that. I'm like, you're doing this for what I want if, and then I fill in the blank with that statement, right? Because as you know, I'm big on feel. Like, I think a lot of people don't really understand how their body works biomechanically, but they can get a sensation. So if I can explain that to you in a sensation that resonates and you're hunting for that feeling, I can get you training how I want. So it's kind of
Mhm.
intuitive.
Oh, for sure. Oh, I love that. I love that. I mean, that's, I love that style of coaching that you bring out because I think, again, it gets people where they need to be, but it doesn't in a way that engenders self-trust
Right.
rather than feeling like they have to do something right or wrong. I do very, very little in-person PT anymore. Pretty much everything I do is online, but I did one of my few in-person sessions today. And this is the first time that this guy has showed up and literally told me what he feels. And I was like, hold on. What did you just tell me? And he was like, well, all sheepish. The guy runs an enormous company. He's all sheepish. He's like, well, can you tell me that I should like trust my body and do what And I'm like, yes, that is literally what we've spent the last many months working on with you.
Right.
It,
Yeah. And
so
see, like
love that coaching style.
that's why I always lean into and I try to explain to people like bodybuilding is an art, right? Like it's a
Mhm.
sensation, it's a feeling, it's like an aura, right? Like I know when I'm on a muscle because it's screaming at me. Um,
Yeah.
and I realize that so many
Roll up.
yeah, so many people want to make it like this mechanical, precise, like if I do
Ugh.
this to this and this to this, it's gonna work. And I'm like, how does it feel though? And they're like, they can't think that way because it's like, well, that's not what this thing's told me to do.
Well, I think if I could speak to that a little bit, because this is the way I've explained it to Dave and to some others too, is like we're taught to think in these like levers and pulleys, and that's kind of like putting beef jerky on our body.
Right.
Does our muscle tissue, have we talked about this? Does
I
our
don't think
muscle
so.
tissue look like beef jerky? No, it's inflated, it's full of water. it does a lot of this, right? So when we try to artificially constrain it, we're literally taking the mind of, so we learn about a lot about, actin, myosin, sliding filament theory, blah, 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 blah. Well, there's another molecule called titin. And what titin does is actually provide three-dimensional structure that's in the form of a helix.
Okay.
What helix does is compress and expand.
Right.
That is how our muscles function. And so when we try to stay super locked in the super rigid, like, mechanical, like not only are we like, of course it doesn't feel good.
Yep.
Like it's not how our muscles work.
You know what's funny is I've always felt like that when I can get that muscle like ebb and flowing very well for me. I could not have described it like a helix, like you said, but that's what I'm thinking about. Like stretch, expand, and then compress. And I viewed it almost like a spring, but that's more like
Yeah.
coiling, which is really a kind of a even cooler analogy.
Coiling is perfect. I use that when I'm talking about other things. There's like the whole nerdy, that's a different, yes, coiling.
Yeah. Because the muscles that I can connect with really well, like I didn't have to learn that. I could just feel it. Where the muscles that I don't connect with, it took time, effort, and energy to acquire
Mhm.
it. Which is where I don't think most people are spending enough time. And especially this is perfect for back because to me it becomes harder because you can't see it, right? Like a lot of times if I said if you're like Chris, like my root, I don't know if my side delts are working. I'm like, all right, we'll strip down to a tank top, Danny, and do your side laterals. What do you see? Like, is it stretching and contracting? You would know well, you would, but I'm trying to think maybe more of a more
No, I
general
think
person.
I think you're right. Most people would know.
Right. Like, can you see it working? Well, with the back, it's like, I don't know. I feel everything's burning. And because there's so much muscle back there. And if you think like, all right, cool, there's also traps and there's also biceps and forearms and there's also traps and rear delts that come into play. It's like, it's so much shit going on. It's like, oh, well, am I on that low lat? For example,
Yeah.
becomes it becomes a trickier body part for me, in my opinion.
Well, I think the more load there is and the more relative motion is required for a movement, generally the fewer the more constraints on the system in terms of like load, relative motion, like as we add on those things, we have to be more and more both fluid and more precise with what we're feeling, right? It generally means that it may be really, really easy for our body to cheat because again, we call it cheating, but it's our brain's way of problem solving. Like our brain's like, hey, I'm doing the thing, we're winning,
Right. Yep.
right? Like, even if it's not, accomplishing the goal.
Yep.
Um, One of the biggest hacks I have for people
Mhm.
with back training is playing with grip. And I think this is something that you and I did when I was out there with you.
Yes.
Back training in its finest and most simple form is all about creating space that you can then move into.
Right.
And even if you just take your hand and you reach in front of you, like you're taking up space, you're going to get more space if you turn your hand than if you keep it locked, right? So when it comes to back training, especially for people who have poor scapular mobility, poor hip mobility, because that's going to throw your pelvis and low back into position, things like that. Um, if they're having a hard time connecting, one of the first things I'll have them do is go straight to a unilateral movement
Yes.
because they're allowed to cheat just a little bit. And if they can find more motion and more space to take up, they're going to have more space to move back into. There's like nerdy ways I could explain that, but what's the point? Like that's the simplest way we can think about it.
You did.
And grip is going to play a big role in
You didn't have to tell me any of that to know that one arm feels better. And I've expressed that.
that.
Like, oh, this one arm. Now, listen, I just had a pump session last Friday where I did nothing but one arm stuff the whole time because it just felt so good. And I was like, why do I need to go to something double arm if I know I'm nailing it with the single? Like, so again,
Yeah,
more logic. Something else that I would be really missing in for our audience that I don't think enough people pay attention to is their neck when rowing. So
totally.
could you talk about like, because listen, the instinct when rowing gets hard to do this is huge. So can you talk about like where my chin and neck are in related to my torso and how that impacts your back training?
Well, I think the crux of the issue here is pressure management.
Right. Yep.
And pressure management comes down to a couple of things. I think the components that are useful to talk about here are going to be um, rib cage expansion, neck position, because that's going to be like we close this off. That's part of how we manage pressure, right?
Yep.
And the more compression we have on the back of us, meaning like the more muscular activity, it's going to change some of this pressure. So neck position is going to depend on, again, I'm going to come back to that kind of wide, narrow bias. But in general, my thought with that is if people are feeling their neck, the first thing I work on with them is pressure management strategies through the rib cage, through the feet.
Right. Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does. Yep. Yeah, because I think a lot of times people are going to say, well, I just let my neck go where it goes. Well, when the set gets hard, right? When you're warming up, yeah. But
Whatever. It's such a terrible PT. I'm like, do whatever you want here, but it doesn't matter.
right, right. Right. But if I think about, like the positioning and rowing and like if the lat stays on versus the upper back, like for me, I can tell you this, like I know that if I'm lazy with my head, I lose that tension in my back. It goes
For
elsewhere.
sure. One
Um,
of the really nerdy parts of this is going to be tongue pressure on the roof of your mouth.
okay, yeah,
Um, like if you could, that's essentially your seal. And when you can create that seal, I mean, if anyone's listening right now, if you just take a lazy breath in and try and feel like where air goes, kind of all up here. But if
right?
you seal that off, did I do this last week where I had you look at like my upper back?
No, I don't think so. Yeah,
Totally expanded. And that's not me doing anything fancy. It's just creating that seal so that when we drive the air in, we're actually changing thoracic volume, not just creating like passive airflow.
right.
Um, so tongue pressure is one of those things that, especially in a row, oh man, you want to really give yourself a good stable support system.
Mhm.
Close that system.
Right,
Um,
right.
tongue on the roof of the mouth.
I learned that from my massage therapist. I don't know if I
Did
told you.
you seriously?
So
Here
he,
I am thinking I just like dropped a cool bomb. And you're like, yeah, I knew that. Dang it.
for a different reason though, he taught me that for pain management. So if he was like on my quads digging out my adductor, and I mean, there was one day, I mean, I swear to God, it was everything not to go into the fetal position. He's like, Chris, take your tongue and push on the roof of your mouth as hard as you can. And it worked. And he
Yeah.
explained to me in a roundabout way, very similar to what you said, like it shuts down everything else and allows the body to flow, is what he told me or explained to me.
That's more of I would wonder if that's more of like a vasovagal response
Oh, it might be
more than anything. Just knowing that like, hypoglossal is one of the cranial nerves. So there's probably some variation of like, CNS input just from like that cranial nerve perspective versus the biomechanical one, which I've got to be honest, I've not thought about.
right.
But in a lot of like sympathetic tone management, a lot of what people look at is like control of facial muscles, um, tongue position, stuff like that. So, and if you're really sympathetic, I think we talked about this, like you're not going to get great contraction anyway. So there's something to it from that standpoint. But yeah, really interesting to think about both the physiological in terms of CNS, drive, as well as like just strictly biomechanical.
Yeah. All right. So the next thing I think we can talk about here is I think the most rudimentary thing that I get seen where people are teaching a lot with back is it's a simple coaching cue of it's all about just getting your elbows behind your body on a row. Now it's a leading question. I knew why I asked it. Can you explain to the audience why you made that face?
How long do I have? No, just
2.5 minutes.
it is so simple. If you don't have the mobility driving your elbow back, you can't see my shoulder because I'm wearing black, but it's not all actually coming from the back. Shoulder's going to get jammed forward, and you're getting a lot of elbow flexion, wrist flexion, all these other kind of components that feel like you're getting good pull movement, but it's really not actually coming from your back and
Right.
can jack up your shoulders pretty good.
Yes. I can tell you when I intentionally try to ram my elbows behind my body as far as I can, it goes off of my back and into my rear delts and traps. And it feels terrible in here.
Yeah, yeah. So if people don't have posterior capsule mobility, which in general people don't, someone who's a wide has a lot of muscle like yourself, you're not going to have great posterior capsule mobility. Someone who's narrow like myself, are more concentrically oriented back there anyway, so we're not going to be able to move well, given that orientation musculature. So different reasons, but in general, people aren't great at getting like that ball and socket back.
Yes. Which tends to lead to my next question, which is, we always hear this too, is like if you want lat, you got to keep your elbow in close to your rib cage, right? Now, that makes perfect sense if you're a 150-pound dude. The problem is I have all this fucking meat back here that runs into my lat. So in order to get range back there, I have to come out to the side more, which isn't that more upper back? So could we go into that?
But I took a continuing ed course where, of course, like, people look at shoulder flexion and things like that. And I literally went, none of my clients can get into that position
Right.
here. Like, you just don't have the space to move into.
Yes.
So the rib cage is going to end up turning. So you basically end up turning your rib cage to create yourself a little space to move into.
Yes. Correct. Yeah. So if you think about that, if I'm on a DY row, I literally have to position my body like this to get tight.
Yeah, I'll probably step off to the side a little bit. I think
Correct.
back training, like I'm literally giving away the biggest hack I can think of. If you're not feeling your back for any movement, whether it's for a bilateral movement where you're supposed to be keeping things so close to your side, or an overhead where you're supposed to be driving straight down, literally give yourself more space to move into. That's it. Cheat how you need to. Because most of us don't have the shape to move like a textbook does. But I don't know. What do you think about elbow close to the side and lat training and things like that?
It
I mean, like
sounds
in general, we don't want it out here,
correct.
but
Yeah.
the line of pull is different.
To me, because someone saw me doing like one of the videos I posted on it, doing a dumbbell row. And they're like, oh, that's really cool. You're doing that dumbbell row for your upper back. And I'm like, no. No. This is a smaller guy, right? So like he doesn't understand like when you get to a certain size, like muscle literally runs into yourself. Like you lose space, right? Where he comes from a background where he teaches exercise based on his body type, which isn't very big. So it's like, oh, well, of course for you that aligns perfectly. It used to at one
Yeah.
point for me too, but then you get bigger and you're like, okay, like, well, now I
The
have to
tissue in the way,
right.
which
So
is going to change how your movement patterns develop, which
yeah,
is going to add more tissue and kind of push you further down that route. I think that's why, as a therapist, when people come to me, they're like, what's something unique that your people have? I'm like, mass. And I'm not just talking about it from the standpoint of like, they have muscles. It's like, no, like you've layered now reps on reps on reps, moving differently because you have that problem. So you have to get more creative with training.
yeah. I mean, like you said, I think there's a fine medium. I would love to tell you that my form can keep my elbows close to my rib cage, but I can't, like, because then I run out of space or I have to manipulate my body into a point where I have to get to it. I know that by the textbook that makes the most sense. But if you actually take me in the gym and practically work on me, it's almost impossible. So, I think you have to be a fine medium of, like you said, you don't want up here, but it's probably more like right there. Um, for most exercises.
I think we can even break that down a little bit more, right? To where if we're thinking about the lat's line of pull, if the lat has basically adjusted over time as you've gotten bigger, even if you're out here, relative to that lat's line of pull, you might be in like a neutral position.
Right.
Does that make sense?
He does. Yep.
To where here you're actually relatively closed off and relatively adducted already. And if
Yep.
you're already adducted, you've got no more, adduction extension to kind of run into.
Yeah. Agreed.
Um, so I think that's probably the big principle that I would, if we're talking just from the biomechanical standpoint, if we're looking at lines of pull,
Mm. Yeah.
recognizing the relative position, even if it doesn't look like, textbook, based on your anthropometrics, your relative position might actually be right where it needs to be.
And I think the last thing to really wrap this thing up, Danny, is grip, right? Where if we think about all facets of grip, whether that be tight or loose or strapped in, do you have a thought process? Like if someone said to you, like, man, I really want to help develop my back the most, are you a fan of straps or no?
Yeah. What about you?
Same, same.
I mean, is there ever a time where, unless someone's looking for like powerlifting, like competition training or strongman training, is there ever a time where you don't want somebody to use straps?
No, I don't, no,
Yeah.
not one bit. And I mean, I can tell you why I broke that finger or that whole this was shattered and I never got it fixed when I was in 10th grade because I didn't want to stop
Wow.
playing. So this whole part of my hand, like these last two joint fingers, are useless for grip. Like I have almost no strength in that part of my hand.
That's so interesting.
Yeah,
So on
pretty
your
bad.
other hand, if you come and you make a fist,
Uh-huh.
If you grab with like these three fingers, you're gonna feel stuff on the front side working. If
Yeah.
you grab with these three, you're gonna feel stuff on the back side.
Yeah.
So on your right side, that's your right side, correct?
Yes. Yep.
So on your right side, you probably have a really hard time getting in an external rotation based position. And ER is also up here. Like this is
Yes.
technically an external rotation bias,
Yeah.
just based on scapular congruency at the rib cage. Do you have a harder time getting overhead with right than left?
Yes. No, here's what's funny too is like my right side lat is more developed, but the entire left side feels more natural and is stronger.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that is because you already live turned to your right. So if
Mhm.
you're turning right, you have more space to move into on your left, just based on testing from when I saw you last, unless that's changed.
I don't know. It's pretty much the exact same.
But I
Um,
mean, that's an interesting thing for people to think about too. Like we made that video about, when do you want to use a single arm row? When does it matter? Like, do you have to use the same foot position on both sides? And the answer is no, you do not.
yeah.
So they can reference your channel for that too.
Yes. Yeah. And that's a great video we did together. And then to wrap up grip, like I know a lot of people see like Hani teaching all his guys to do like fully supinated underhand barbell rows. Like for me, anything in both extremes feel terrible, meaning fully pronated and fully underhand. I actually love neutral, semi-supinated, and semi-pronated. So I like all those like here, here, here. Do you feel the same way? Or you think most people are that way? Or
Yeah. I think in general, the more we speak in extremes, the higher the cost that comes with it. So is there potential for maybe more contraction, especially we're thinking like rhomboids, right?
yes,
Maybe, yeah, but is there also a high cost if that doesn't go well? Absolutely. So in general, I think given most people aren't Chris Bumstead, I think staying in the middle ground is probably the best. So,
agreed.
like neutral, semi-pronated, semi-supinated.
Yes. And that's what I found in-person training and clients that come in or this report
Hmm.
is like those tend to just feel more natural. And I'm like, hey, well, don't shove your fucking wrists into things that aren't natural.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
there have been plenty of people who grew massive biceps not doing barbell curls. Like easy bar and dumbbells work just as well.
I have someone I'm working with right now who had been dealing with forearm and elbow pain for like a year and a half kind of thing, just on and off. And he
Yeah,
didn't tell me about it initially. We were working on something else, and then he mentioned it briefly. And he was feeling it on his push days, but it was stemming from his pull days. And it's
right.
because he was forcing his hand and wrist into positions that he had no business being into. But people will use this to try to make up for this.
Yes, agreed. Agreed. Like if you made me get
Check your shoulder mobility.
in a true shoulder width underhand grip, I couldn't stay that long. And
No, because your front delt's in the way.
yeah, yeah. And looking
High
like
quality problem. We're
uh,
the problem.
yeah, yeah. 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 That's speaking to privilege, right?
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah.
It's
So,
it's funny. I think grip and hand position is one of the things that I work on with Dave a lot, just as he's gotten bigger and his back has gotten bigger. I mean, you've seen the meat he's added, and a lot of that has been due to what you've given him with the Edmonds row. Like that has been his staple. But the more size he adds on, the more I have to like look at his elbow position and what I see for a lot of people is they end up trying to manipulate their hand and wrist to make up for poor shoulder mobility, and especially on a back day, that's a great way to really get elbows irritated. Great way to get forearms overused, and it will carry over into your push day. So let's say you pull on Monday and you go to push on Tuesday. Um, that can really, really affect your ability to get into a good depth with good control. So.
anyone who does back with more than once a week, if you aren't mindful of that, you will definitely develop elbow issues so fast, is what I found. Like
Mhm.
the next thing you know, then it starts impacting your arm training and like skull crushers begin to hurt. And even then it progresses. If you continue to hammer, it begins to progress into, oh, my cable pushdowns hurt. And then I know we're in a bad spot. Like, and
Do
again,
you see that mostly stem from pole training?
yes.
Do you see any other, this might be kind of an odd question. Do you see any other injuries pop up on other days that you think are like as a result of their pull training?
Yeah, this is a weird correlation. Like I've had people complain to me with they're doing so much pull that even gripping the handles on like a hack squat or a leg press begin to make their elbows feel irritated when they get off of it.
Hmm.
And then if you have a like a barbell back squat in there, then you're like, Chris, like I can barely grab the bar anymore. And I've always assumed that that was stemming from the amount of pull that we were having to do to either bring up the back or what I was using to counteract shoulder issues. Because some weird anecdotal stuff that I've always found that works well is if you have shoulder issues, we do 3 rows or pull downs to every one chest press. Like that tends to cure some shoulder issues. But if you're pressing three exercises for chest, that means we got to do 12 exercises for back. So then what happens is if you aren't smart with exercise selection with your back training and you're forcing your wrists into certain positions that aren't natural and you won't tell me that, then we start
Hmm.
getting wrist issues and elbow issues. And it's like to me, that's a weird roundabout way to say yes.
No, no, I love when you just riff like that. That to me is that's my favorite criticisms come out of you just riffing like that. Do you
That's a
tend to see that at like certain points in the range of motion and certain movements more than others?
yes. Anything barbell row related, a lot of times it's like fully pronated rowing in a machine that locks you in. And that could be a Smith machine or like a Cybex row or a hammer strength. Like I knew very early on, like my body was in tune with exercise that I knew like that doesn't feel right. Like if I like there's a reason like a chest supported T-bar row, if there were handles were here, here, and here, I knew those last two if fully neutral and semi-pronated feel better. That
Yeah,
right there felt like dog shit. Like, and I
yeah,
didn't know why, but I could just tell you by doing it, no, it's a no-go for me.
for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Your gut is always so spot on. Well, what happened last week that we were talking about where you posted something and I was like, this is literally something I've coached clients into, but you said it in a way that just you made it more like digestible rather than me being like, well, the concept of orientation is with you heal and the reference centers.
I
But
think it
I'll take it.
I think it was the that super slow hack squat, maybe. Was that it?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Well, you just did the same thing with a lot of upper back movements.
Yeah. Heck yeah.
I'm sitting here like, well, if the collarbone is they're already living in an elevated position, airly tip position, and they try you can't go where you are, they're already protracted, they can't protect more, which is true, but let's make this real simple.
Yep. Both of those can be equally simultaneously true.
Oh wow.
Yeah. But I think I think that's what's great about our dynamic though, is like you can tell me all that and just confirms all the shit that I feel. And then on vice versa, it's got to be nice for you to know that, like, hey, all of this practical knowledge, or sorry, all of this science knowledge that you've acquired over years of working with people translates into someone like me who's like doesn't look at exercise that way.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I'm in this weird boat where people know I'm a clinician and I'm a PT, but really like I'm just a meathead, right? Like, am I thinking about these in my own training? No.
Right, right.
No, like, God, I can't even do my own PT and warm-ups. I'm in such a rush. I'm like, all right, I've got 30 minutes to get a pump. Let's go.
Right.
So sometimes it's nice to just be able to take some of these things and like allow them to help things make sense to other people. Again, I think we both have the same heart in this, and that kind of comes back to the coaching style and coaching methodology um, that we talked about early on with it should engender self-trust, right? Rather than have to do it a certain way.
You
And
know, and if you think about like the original mission of why you and I start, or I reached out to you originally to start doing these, is like I wanted to help the most amount of people possible. And I'm quickly realizing that the way you speak about exercise, all these people over here want it. And the way I speak about it, all these people want it. Well, what if we talk at the same time and then we can all grow together? Like maybe that's a little bit too kumbaya, so to speak.
no, I love it. Rising tide raises all ships, right? And if we are in that boat and we're both rowing forward, we're both going to go forward.
And I think this is the biggest thing, right? Is like I'm not so egotistical to know that you're right, but so am I. And it could be completely different topics, like where I think that's where there's this huge disconnect. Is like a lot of people like may look at the way I speak and present online, or they may look at the way you look physically preparing for the Olympia, and they're like, "Oh, juice heads, meatheads, stupid ass. They don't know shit. They just know how to ram a needle." and they don't understand that, like, well, yes, that is involved in the sport that we do. But there is a higher level of knowledge between you and I that can really help a lot of people grow the most amount of muscle in the shortest amount of time possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think one way to think about that too is that we've got this bell curve of people, right? And most people are going to be okay staying right in the middle of that bell curve.
Yeah.
But that's not everyone. There's a lot of people out here, and the longer you train, the more you're going to fall into one of these categories. This isn't like you train longer and you stay more in the middle. This is like you start to become more and more and more of an outsider because, or outlier rather, because there are different things that develop within your body the longer you train.
Yes.
I just had to articulate some of this to the business coach that I was talking about with you, and had to kind of articulate. He was like, "What do you mean you don't do nutrition? All you do is training?" Like, and I was like, "Because there are layers to this, homeboy."
Right. Yeah.
Like there are some layers to the way that we go about not only program design, but okay, well, we know someone's body is going to work a certain way. How do we pick movements that are going to work well for them? How do we structure the session in a way that's going to leave them better rather than worse? Like, how many people do you talk to that feel like training is creating a future problem for them, but they don't know what to do without it? So they just assume they're like, this is a cliff I'm just going to run off of.
Right.
Well, what if we could avoid that?
Or what if I give you a parachute?
Right. Or what if we give you some like enormous trampoline so you can like just, I don't know, clear whatever cliff you've got. I don't know. Some solution. Like literally one different thought away from having a solution of this mindset that training is going to be something that leaves you broken instead of better. And that's where you and I are like, doesn't matter how, let's just get there.
And that's to me what separates your level of service and knowledge from everyone else is you understand that everyone is a unique individual. And just because it should work this way, it may not. Right? Like that's what I've learned from you. It's like, okay, well, yes, you can train rear delts that way, but you can also train it this way if you're built like this. And it's
But
like,
that's also what you do too, right? Like that's why we worked together right off the get-go, is it was just I was like, I need someone to take the thought out of this for me. And you were like, here, this, and this. And I was like, great. Can we make a small change? Yeah, here, try this. Awesome. Perfect. Good to go.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
so
I think I pray the next generation or iteration of bodybuilding goes down the path for the next 3 to 5 years is that it's more amoeba based and everyone isn't so locked into a box. And it's like, hey, like we need to be way more fluid with water as opposed to rigid like a brick. And I realized that
mhm.
that's going to create a host of issues of like people like you and I will thrive and others who are very much like regurgitate will hate.
I think the coaching industry is going to contract hugely. It was something I spoke about at last office hours with people was this industry is going to contract where it's not going to be enough to be really smart from a textbook standpoint anymore. 3 to 5 years, if that's all you can do, you don't have the practical knowledge and you're only good at one thing,
Yes.
you're really going to be struggling from a business standpoint. But people who can, jack of all trades, master of none, often better than a master of one,
Yeah. Yeah.
will
I mean,
thrive.
yeah, you'd either have to hyper niche yourself or niche yourself, however you want to say that, or you're gonna have to develop a skill set that is very flexible, adaptable, and then also learn on the go. Like, I don't think that's
Yeah.
the biggest thing about you and I is like we have never reached a point where we shut our brain off and like, oh, we know it all. Like we're good.
Oh, dude, getting to train with you in person when you were like, oh, I've never seen that done that way. It's wild to me how many people in their 30s and 40s just like kind of bank on what what they've been doing.
Yep. Yep.
And one of my favorite things about you is just how much you're like willing to take on different solutions. Like, oh, I bet that could be a solution for someone else.
Yeah, I
So
mean, that's what I love about training is experimentation. Like it's always fun. Like that's what is enjoyable to me. Like I can't imagine going into the gym and doing the same, let's say 20 exercises every week. Yes, but it'd still be fulfilling, of course. But it wouldn't be as much fun to me where I'm like, ooh, like this would feel really good. What if I did this or put this handle on it or got this attachment or put my feet here, or move my chin here, like like that to me, or what if you start looking at things like exercise sequencing and like, ooh, what if we fucked around and put quads at the end, like all different types of things that to me,
creativity.
right, are fun. And I think I see that so many times with the masters competitors I get to coming to me.
Mm,
They've done things this way that's gotten them broken. And they're so married to it because they got all the results from it up until this point. Like, okay, now this is taking you down. I need you to erase all that shit. I need you to rely on faith in this program, but also realize that like I can still work some of your old stuff in, but we got to do it intelligently. So,
Yeah, yeah,
instead
yeah,
of
for sure.
back squatting 6 plates where you're really doing more of a hinge, what if we what if we squatted at the end and got you to use a heel wedge? Oh shit, now you can feel your quads again, right? Oh, but the bad thing is you have 3 plates as opposed to 6. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Man, I'm in that process right now. I got back in the hack for the first time in a minute. I felt my quads, but you know what I had on there? Quarter. And
Well,
then this is coming from someone who's done a triple body weight low bar squat. Like I'm not a weak squatter. But for quad building purposes, I really am.
right, yeah, yeah.
I'm,
I mean, listen, I reset my form on shit all the time and go back to like what most people, well, what I would consider a baby weight. Like, I'm like, hey, like let's relearn this movement pattern the right way, or for how I'm set up and structured now. Like, let's stop cheating this shit because I'm losing potential growth. Is how I look at that.
Mhm.
Where
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
like, to me that's exciting. And if you have to reset a lift, it's like okay, cool. Like if I'm doing dumbbell rows and it's like, well, I refixed my form. I'm back to 90. I was doing 160s. Okay, I have 70-pound gap to bridge, but now I'm going to get here again with good form, and that may take 3 or 6 months, but who gives a shit? Like that progression is going to be fun.
Kind of fun. I've actually on my leg day the last few days, kind of gotten really excited because it feels like I'm learning to train for the first time.
Right. Yes.
Like I've taken out a lot of intensifiers and well, except for most intensifiers and just really focused on like getting on the muscle again, like we talked about.
Yep.
And it's been a lot of fun again. I think the longer we've been training, we think we have to like go in and actually smash ourselves and like, yeah, you and I love doing that. Like, let me take a session, let me take a set to seizure, but
A set to seizure.
set to seizure. Not kidding. Um, yeah, it's been fun kind of building in that skill and actually feeling good again.
Yeah. Yeah. To me, like that's what the most fun of training is just having had being almost sometimes forced into it too creates
Totally.
to me creates it's a positive sense of urgency where it's like, okay, here is a new, I'm gonna say problem, right? Like the muscle isn't doing this or my body isn't doing that or it's not responding the way I want. So like, let's try to find a new solution. And then, okay, cool. Where that tends to come to for most of the time, for me at least, is humbling myself in terms of ego wise and reducing the weight. Like that's the to wrap this all up. I think that's the biggest thing is like for me, when I
Mhm.
was talking about that, learning how to train my rear delt, I was doing 35, 40 pound rear laterals and had no rear delt. And I dropped down to the tens and said, okay, well, if I can't do it if I'm not growing with 40, 50 is not going to do anything different. Let's go the other direction and let's go to the far extreme and then
Love
start
it.
again and then build up. Where now it's like, I always try to tell people this, like the amount of girls in the gym who lift heavier weights for me for shoulders, but have no shoulders is more than the people that I see. Like, in the truth of it, unless you work out like an incredibly competitor driven gym, the amount of impressive delts are very small.
Yeah. And everyone's flinging 30s on side laterals.
Yep.
Well, which I guess, sorry, people my size using 30s for side laterals.
Right.
For you, that's like appropriate.
Right.
But whatever.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I would say a good set of side laterals for me, like for 20 is probably 30 or 35s. Yeah. But I'm a little like loose with my form. So
I mean, but like I look at bikini competitors and I'm like, yo, like, why are you using 30s?
12 and a half. That's all you need.
Dang. No kidding.
And that's tough, right? Because it's like, oh, well, awesome. Well, I can see your traps are stealing all of that. Like, can you just like take a deep breath? Like the shoulders are there. We got to find them. Like you got to get on it. And like that's to me like that again is probably why most people don't progress because they're so tied to that logbook. They're like, well, last time I wrote 25 pounds for 12 reps and I got to either get 14 reps or go to the 30s. Like, I'm like, what if
Or it
we
was a
did,
wasted session.
right? What if I did the
Oh,
20s but better? Like,
yeah,
that,
yeah, yeah.
that thought process has evaded so many because I think you've probably trained with enough people to know, like, I've had guys come to town and use the same weights as me, but the set wasn't the same. You know what
No.
I mean? Like there's a control with the weight, there's a control with that dumbbell or barbell or the ownership of the weight is how I kind of view it, right? Like, and maybe it's because I had Dorian Yates like burned in my brain. Like he always said, And what I remembered is if I can't stop that weight in any portion of the rep, I don't own and possess it. And not saying that we're gonna do that, but if we were training and you said, Chris, like stop, can I stop it? And like I guess I've always thought about that.
I love that. That's a good way to think about it, putting your authority on the weight rather than the other way around.
Right. Because I mean it's like pin the muscle, stay on it, and then not let off of it. And if you're using inertia or momentum, that's not muscle.
Yeah, 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 for sure, for sure.
Or at least that's how I've thought about it for bodybuilding. If you're a strength athlete, where that's a whole different conversation.
Well, we could talk about on another episode too, like when might you not need to control all of the negative, even for something like a run? Because I do think there are times where it's important to look at that, and I can kind of, split hairs with that one, but in general, yeah.
Yeah, that's an incredible topic. Yeah, I actually think I like that a lot. Um, yeah. Oh yeah. All right. Until next time, we've been on forever.
Yeah, for real.
We'll
Thanks,
see you
guys.
guys.